The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and Victor Crow read it twice before he smiled. The ranch at Red Hollow had a new problem coming. A woman with a baby and no husband waiting for her. No money, no connections, and no idea what kind of territory she was walking into. Crow folded the paper carefully, tucked it into his breast pocket, and told his man Deke to ride out to the station. "Make sure she knows nobody's coming for her," he said, "and make sure she understands she doesn't belong here." He didn't even look up from his ledger when he said it. That was the thing about Victor Crow. He didn't need to raise his voice to ruin a person's life. He just needed to make sure they had nowhere left to turn. If you've ever felt like the whole world decided your fate before you even walked through the door, if you've ever had someone look at you and see a problem instead of a person, then you already know something about what Evelyn Harper felt the moment she stepped off that train. She just didn't know yet how bad it was going to get. Before we go further, if stories like this one stay with you long after you've finished watching, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Every one of you watching from somewhere new reminds me why these stories matter. Now let's get into it. Evelyn Harper had been awake for going on 31 hours when the train finally groaned to a stop at the Red Hollow station. She hadn't slept, not really. Lily had been fussing since Kansas, teething again, her small gums swollen and mean, and Evelyn had spent most of the journey holding her upright in the dark, pressing a damp cloth against the baby's face and whispering things she didn't entirely believe. "We're almost there. It's going to be fine. Someone's waiting for us." The station platform was half the size she'd imagined, dry and bleached and loud with the kind of heat that hits you like a wall the second you step out of a shaded car. Two men were arguing near the water barrel. A dog slept under a wagon. Three women in bonnets watched her step down from the train with expressions she recognized immediately. That particular combination of curiosity and judgment that women reserved for other women they'd already decided they didn't like. Evelyn shifted Lily to her left hip and used her right hand to pull her suitcase down. She'd asked the conductor for help, and he'd looked at the baby and looked away. Fine. She didn't need it. She stood on the platform and looked around for a man named Gerald Foss. She'd been writing to Gerald Foss for 7 months. His letters had been careful and slow and a little stiff, the way a man writes when he's more comfortable working with his hands than with words. He told her about the ranch, 120 acres west of town, decent water, cattle that were mostly healthy. He told her he was a practical man who needed a practical woman. He hadn't promised her love. She hadn't asked for it. She was 29 years old with another woman's baby and a dead sister's debt, and she had been entirely honest with Gerald Foss about all of it. He had written back and said, "Come anyway." So she came. He wasn't on the platform. She waited 20 minutes, 30. The women in bonnets drifted away. The men finished arguing. The dog woke up and wandered off somewhere. Lily started crying again. Not the loud, furious cry of real pain, but that grinding, exhausted whimper that meant she was hungry and overtired and didn't understand why nothing was better yet. Evelyn jostled her gently and kept watching the road. A man in a dirty hat finally walked over. Not Gerald Foss, this man was younger, with flat eyes and a way of standing that made the air around him feel smaller. "You the mail order woman?" he said. "I'm Evelyn Harper. I'm here to meet Gerald Foss." The man took his hat off, scratched at something behind his ear, and put it back on. "Foss sold the ranch," he said. "Packed up 2 weeks ago. Nobody knows where he went." She heard the words. She understood them. But they didn't quite connect, the way sometimes you hear news so bad your brain takes a few seconds to catch up with your ears. "That's not possible," she said. "I have letters." "Lady." The man said it the way people say it when they want you to stop talking. "I'm telling you what I know. He's gone. The ranch went to a fella named Crow." He paused. "You got anyone else here in town?" She didn't. "Somewhere to stay?" She shook her head. The man made a short sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Then he turned and walked away. Evelyn stood there on that platform in the Arizona heat with a crying 7-month-old on her hip and exactly $3.40 in her pocket, the last of what she'd had after buying her train ticket, and she understood for the first time in her life what it meant to have nothing left to fall back on. Not a plan, not a person, nothing. She found out later that the man with the flat eyes was one of Crow's people. that he'd been sent to the station specifically to deliver that information, specifically to make sure she felt it. But she didn't know that yet. What she knew was that she needed to find somewhere to put Lily down for an hour. The baby had stopped crying and gone to that scary, silent place infants go when they're too exhausted to protest anymore. And Evelyn's arm was aching from the weight of her, and her throat was dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. She picked up her suitcase and walked into town. Red Hollow was 3 blocks of storefronts and 2 blocks of houses, with a church at one end and a saloon at the other. She went to the general store first because it was the closest, and the woman behind the counter, older, with gray hair pinned too tight and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looked at her with immediate suspicion. "I'm looking for a place to stay," Evelyn said. "A boarding house, or a room for let. Just for a few nights until I can sort out a situation." "What kind of situation?" the woman said. Evelyn explained briefly. Gerald Foss, the letters, the train, the platform. She kept it factual. She didn't ask for pity. The woman listened with her arms crossed and her mouth pulled to one side. When Evelyn finished, she said, "Well, Foss was a fool and a drunk. That's no surprise he ran off." She looked at Lily. "That your baby?" "She's my niece. I'm raising her." The woman picked up a cloth and began wiping the counter, even though it was already clean. "There's no boarding house in Red Hollow. Mrs. Alcott on Birch Street takes in the occasional traveler, but she's got her sister visiting." She paused. "You might ask at the church." "Thank you," Evelyn said, and she meant it, because it was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in the last 2 hours. She went to the church. The minister was out. His wife answered the door, looked at Evelyn and Lily, looked at the suitcase, and told her she could sleep in the back room tonight, but only tonight because her mother-in-law was expected on Thursday. "Thank you," Evelyn said again. The back room smelled like old hymnals and mousetraps. There was a cot and a basin of water and no window. Evelyn set Lily on the cot, changed her, fed her the last of the mashed potatoes she'd carried in a jar from the train, and then sat on the edge of the cot and put her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since her sister Martha died, and she didn't intend to start now. But she sat there for a long time with her face in her hands while Lily made small contented sounds and grabbed at the edge of the blanket, and Evelyn thought very clearly about what she'd given up to come here. Her room at Mrs. Gallagher's boarding house in Harrisburg. The laundry work she'd been doing, enough to keep herself and Lily fed if nothing else. The 2 women on her block who'd become something like friends. Not close, but enough. The familiar weight of a city she at least knew how to navigate. She'd left all of it for a man who sold his ranch and didn't have the decency to write and tell her. She lifted her face from her hands. She was not going to die in a back room that smelled like mouse traps. The next morning she went to the saloon, which she knew most people would consider improper, but saloons were where information lived in frontier towns, and she needed information more than she needed anyone's good opinion. The bartender was a wide man named Holt, who seemed amused rather than offended by her presence. She told him she was looking for work, anything respectable, laundry, cooking, mending. She told him she was also looking for affordable housing and would appreciate any leads. Holt leaned on the bar and looked at her for a moment. "You're the mail order woman," he said. "Word travels fast." "Always does." He poured her a glass of water without her asking and slid it across the bar. "There's a few ranches that take on domestic help. The Halverson place east of town. Maybe the Breyer operation, though Old Man Breyer's a difficult sort." He paused. "Wilder runs a spread about 12 miles out. He's not the type to ask for help, but he might take somebody on. He's been running that place alone since his hired man left for California." "Wilder," she said. "Caleb Wilder. You'll see him in town maybe once every couple weeks." Holt picked up a glass and began polishing it. "Honest fella. Bit cold. Doesn't talk much." Cold and quiet was fine with her. Loud, friendly men had been making her promises her whole life. She thanked him and took the glass of water to a table in the corner and sat in thought while Lily slept against her shoulder. The minister's wife had made it clear this morning, politely but firmly, that today was her last day in the back room. She had 2 nights at most before she'd be sleeping under the open sky with a baby in the middle of the Arizona desert, and she was very clear-eyed about what that would mean. She had to find Caleb Wilder before he left town. She found him at the feed store at 10:30, loading 50-pound sacks onto a wagon with the kind of practiced efficiency that meant he'd done it so many times His body just knew where to put his hands. He was taller than she expected, lean, dark-haired, with the particular quality of stillness some men develop when they spend most of their time working alone. Not handsome exactly, but the kind of face you kept looking at because it was so thoroughly itself. All angles and weathered skin, and a jaw that looked like it had been set at a certain angle 20 years ago and hadn't shifted since. "Mr. Wilder," she said. He turned around. His eyes went from her face to Lily and back to her face, and he didn't react to the baby the way most men did, with alarm or with a little flinch of complication. He just looked. "Miss," he said, "my name is Evelyn Harper. I'm told you might be looking for domestic help at your ranch." "Told by who?" "Holt at the saloon." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Holt talks." "He does, but he was trying to help." She shifted Lily on her hip. "I can cook, clean, manage a household, and do basic repairs. I learn quickly. I won't cost you much, and I won't be any trouble." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Who's the baby?" "My niece. My sister died 6 months ago. There's no one else." "You bring her everywhere?" "She's 7 months old, Mr. Wilder. I don't have anywhere to leave her." He considered this. He picked up another sack and slung it onto the wagon, and she watched him do it because she didn't know what else to do with herself in the middle of what felt like an audition she hadn't prepared for. "I don't need a cook," he said finally. "I'm fine on my own." "You might be fine," she said, "but I'm not. I came to this town for a man who ran off before I arrived. I have $3 left, a baby on my hip, 1 night's shelter left before I'm sleeping outside, and no connections in this territory. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." She paused. "There's a difference." He looked at her again. Longer this time. 12 miles is a long way out," he said. "I walked 11 miles once to reach a train station in Pennsylvania. I'll manage 12. He was quiet for a moment. He tied down the load on the wagon, checked the rope, and tied it again. She watched him do all of it and told herself she was not going to say anything else. She'd said what she had to say. "My hired man left a room off the kitchen," he said. "It's not much. There's a cot and a window. Your girl can sleep there with you." He paused. "Room and board in exchange for whatever help around the house you can manage. Cash pay would be what I can spare at the end of the month, which right now is not much." "That's fine," she said, "and I want it clear between us." He said it seriously, directly, looking at her without any softness in it. "I'm not looking for anything except help with the household. Nothing else." "Neither am I," she said, just as directly. He nodded. "Wagon leaves in an hour." She used the hour to collect her suitcase from the church and say a clipped thank you to the minister's wife, who wished her well with an expression that suggested she had her doubts. She climbed onto the wagon beside Caleb Wilder with Lily on her lap, and they drove 12 miles out of Red Hollow in almost complete silence. And she told herself over and over that this was a reasonable situation and that reasonable situations could be survived. What she didn't tell herself, what she wouldn't have admitted to anyone, least of all herself, was that somewhere in her chest, past all the exhaustion and the dread and the very reasonable fear, there was something that felt just barely like hope. She ignored it. Hope had made a fool of her before. She watched the desert roll by and kept her eyes forward and told herself to be practical. The ranch was not what she'd imagined. Not worse, exactly, just more honest. The house was low and solid, built close to the ground the way structures in hot climates learn to be, with a porch along the front and a water barrel on the east side, and a barn that had seen better days but was clearly maintained by someone who cared whether it stood or fell. There was a garden on the south side that had been abandoned. She could tell by the dead things in it, the dried stalks and the cracked earth. And she found herself looking at it longer than anything else. Caleb showed her the room without ceremony. Cot, window, wooden hook on the back of the door. A small rug that had been nice once. She put her suitcase down and set Lily on the cot and turned around and said, "It's good, thank you." He showed her where the kitchen was, which she'd already found by smell. Wood smoke and something like coffee, bitter and strong. He showed her where the food was stored, which wasn't much but was organized with a precision that told her he cooked for himself with the same focused economy he did everything else. "Supper's at 6, he said. "I don't care what it is as long as it's hot." "All right." He left. She heard his boots on the porch, and then on the steps, and then silence. She sat down on the edge of the cot next to Lily and looked around the room. The bare walls, the clean floor, the window that faced west and would be full of light in the evenings. And she thought, this is where you start. Not where you arrive. Not where you rest. Where you start. She got up and went to find what she could make for supper. She found beans and salt pork and half a sack of cornmeal, and she made a meal that was simple but hot. And when Caleb came in at 6 exactly and sat down at the table and tasted it, he didn't say anything for a moment, and then he said, "That's good." "The beans needed longer," she said. "I'll know for next time." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read entirely. Most people would have just said thank you. Most people didn't have to make it. He made that almost smile again. Ate in silence. She fed Lily at the other end of the table and pretended not to notice when he glanced at the baby. Not with irritation, she realized, but with something that looked more like discomfort. The kind of discomfort that came from things being unfamiliar, not from things being unwanted. After supper, he washed his own dish, which surprised her, and said goodnight without formality, and she heard the door of his room close quietly at the end of the hall. Lily fell asleep in the cot with her fist pressed against her own cheek, the way she did when she was finally comfortable, and Evelyn lay on her side and stared at the wall. She was 12 miles from a town where nobody knew her, in a house that belonged to a man she'd met 4 hours ago, in a territory where she had no claim on anything except the work she could do with her hands. It was the most alone she'd ever felt. And yet, and this was the part she could not explain and would not have tried to, it was also the first time in months she felt like she could breathe. The first week was careful. That was the only word for it. Both of them moved around each other carefully, measuring out space and silence, and the small courtesies that had to exist between two strangers sharing a house, even when one of them was the employer and one was the help. She learned his routines. He was up before dawn. He ate whatever she left covered on the stovetop without complaint. He came in for the noon meal only if he was close enough to the house. Otherwise, he took whatever she packed him. Bread, dried meat, something jarred. He worked until the light was gone, and sometimes after it. She found the rhythm of the house without anyone telling her what it was. She cleaned, she cooked, she fixed the things that could be fixed with a needle and thread, or a piece of wire, or a firm hand and patience. She replanted the south garden, not all of it, just a section, starting with what would grow fastest, because something in her could not stand the sight of all those dead things when the earth was right there. Caleb didn't mention the garden, but one morning she looked out the window and saw he'd hauled fresh water to the barrel closest to it, which was the one she'd been using. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated a compliment. He was not warm with Lily, exactly, but he was careful around her in a way she hadn't expected from a man who'd lived alone for years. He stopped moving fast when he came through the kitchen, and she was on the floor. He lowered his voice without being asked. One morning, Lily pulled herself up against his boot and looked up at him with the total serious concentration of a baby encountering something new, and Caleb stood very still and looked down at her, and then very slowly crouched down to her level. He didn't speak. Lily reached out and grabbed his finger. He let her hold it for a minute. Then he stood up and walked out without saying anything, and Evelyn turned back to the stove and thought, he's not cold. He just doesn't know what to do with people who haven't left yet. She understood that more than she wanted to admit. It was 11 days in when the first trouble came. She was at the general store, the same woman, tight gray hair, glasses on her forehead, when a man came in behind her that she didn't know. Well-dressed in the way that meant he had money and wanted you to know it. Good coat, polished boots, a watch chain that caught the light when he moved. He was maybe 50, with a wide face and small eyes that missed nothing. He looked at Evelyn the way some men look at something they're calculating the value of. "You're out at the Wilder place," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. "Victor Crow," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it because refusing would have been foolish. His grip was deliberate, not aggressive, just definite, like he was establishing something. "I heard about your situation when you arrived," he said, pleasantly enough. "Unfortunate business with Foss. I tried to make a fair offer on that property, but a man's choices are his own." He smiled. "I was wondering if Caleb's been treating you well." Something about the question was wrong. She couldn't have said exactly what. "Quite well, thank you," she said. "Good. Good." He picked up a bottle from the nearest shelf and looked at it with mild interest. You know, if you ever find yourself in a difficult position out there, if things aren't what you expected, there are other options in this territory. I have a large operation, and I'm always looking for capable people. She looked at him carefully. I'm happy where I am. Of course. He set the bottle down and smiled at her again. I just like people to know their options. He touched his hat. Good day, Miss Harper. He walked out. The woman behind the counter waited until the door was closed, then said quietly, You'd be wise to stay clear of that one. What is he? The woman looked at her over the glasses. A man who gets what he wants, she said, and doesn't much care how. Evelyn walked back to where the wagon was hitched and stood for a moment in the heat. She replayed the conversation, the smile, the questions, the way he'd said other options like they were a gift. He knew where she lived. He knew she'd been desperate when she arrived. He knew, in other words, exactly how to pressure a person if he ever needed to. She climbed onto the wagon and drove back out to the ranch and didn't say anything to Caleb that night. But she thought about it. She thought about it for a long time. What she didn't know yet, what nobody had told her, was that Victor Crow had been trying to acquire Caleb Wilder's ranch for 2 years. Not because of the cattle, not because of the house or the barn, or even the 160 acres of grazing land. Because of what was under it. There was water beneath that ground. Not a small spring, but a serious underground source, the kind that could feed a large-scale farming operation for decades. Crow had paid a man from back east to survey the territory quietly, and the survey had come back clear. The Wilder Ranch sat on top of the most reliable water source in a 50-mile radius. In this land, in this heat, water was not just valuable. Water was everything. Caleb didn't know this either. He knew Crow wanted his land. He'd had 2 offers, both fair on paper, both refused. He told Crow he wasn't selling and assumed that was the end of it. He was wrong, but that was a problem that hadn't arrived yet. What arrived instead, on the 13th night of Evelyn's time at the ranch, was Lily's first real fever sham. It came on fast, the way fevers did in babies. 1 hour she was fussy and warm, the next she was burning and inconsolable. Her small body arched and rigid. Her cry that particular high, thin sound that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to something animal and terrified in Evelyn's chest. She knew what to do. She'd done it before back in Harrisburg when Lily had her first winter cold. Lukewarm water, not cold. Cold could make it worse. Keep her head elevated, watch her breathing. But she had no medicine, and the nearest doctor was 12 miles away. She was doing the calculations in her head, how long to hitch the horse, whether she could manage it alone in the dark, what the night road was like, when she heard movement in the hallway and then a knock at the door. Everything all right? Caleb's voice. She opened the door. He was holding a lamp, squinting against the dark, his hair pushed flat on one side from the pillow. He looked at her face and then past her at Lily and came fully awake. How bad? He said. Bad enough that I'm thinking about the doctor. He was already reaching for his boots. I'll hitch the horse. You don't have to... Miss Harper, he said it simply. I'll hitch the horse. He did it in 10 minutes. They drove through the dark 12 miles to town, Evelyn in the back of the wagon with Lily pressed against her shoulder, and Caleb drove fast but not reckless. She noticed this, even through the fear. He pushed the horse as hard as was safe and no harder. The doctor was grumpy about being woken. He examined Lily and said it was a fever of the teething kind, uncomfortable but not dangerous, prescribed a tincture that he charged Evelyn 40 cents for, and sent them back home. On the drive back, Lily had calmed somewhat. Evelyn sat in the back and let the night air move around her and felt the leftover adrenaline draining out of her like water from a cup. After a while, she said, "Thank you." Caleb didn't turn around. "Didn't do much," he said. "You did enough." He was quiet for a moment, then, "She's all right?" "She will be." He nodded and drove. She watched the back of his head and thought, he didn't have to do that. He absolutely did not have to do that. And he did it anyway, and he didn't make anything of it. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. But something had shifted, just slightly, the way ground shifts before anything is visible on the surface. Something had changed between them that had nothing to do with the work she did in his house, and everything to do with a man who hitched his horse at midnight for a baby that wasn't his and drove through the dark without being asked twice. She stored that information somewhere careful and didn't look at it too closely. Not yet. The tincture worked. Lily's fever broke sometime before dawn, and by morning she was sitting up in the cot making her usual sounds. Not words yet, just opinions, delivered with great conviction to anyone who would listen. Evelyn changed her and fed her and stood in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee she'd made too strong because she hadn't slept and needed it that way, and watched the sun come up over the desert in long flat bands of orange and red. She heard Caleb moving in the barn, the sound of him working, the low knock of wood, the occasional voice he used with the horses, patient and low and direct, had become familiar in 2 weeks in a way she hadn't expected. It had become part of the texture of the place. She went back inside and started breakfast. He came in at 7, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down. She put eggs and salt pork and bread in front of him without being asked. He ate. She sat across from him with Lily in her lap and drank her coffee. "How's she doing?" he said. "Better, back to herself." He nodded, ate another bite. "Good." That was all. And somehow it was enough. She hadn't expected that you could sit across from a person in near silence and it could be comfortable rather than tense. She'd spent years around people who filled silence with noise because they were afraid of what lived in it. Caleb wasn't afraid of silence. He just didn't see the need to fill it with anything that didn't mean something. It was, she thought, the most unusual thing about him, and the most restful. She was still thinking about Victor Crow. She'd said nothing to Caleb about the encounter at the general store, and she wasn't entirely sure why. Partly because she didn't have enough information yet to know what to make of it. Partly because 3 weeks in, she was still measuring what she was and was not entitled to say in this house. She could speak plainly when it came to the work. She was less certain about everything else. But she watched him that morning over the rim of her coffee cup and thought about what the woman at the general store had said. A man who gets what he wants and doesn't much care how. And she thought about how Crow had looked at her, that appraising look, the way his eyes moved like he was checking things off a list. He had wanted her to feel small. She was sure of that now, looking back. The offer of other options hadn't been generosity. It had been reconnaissance. He was finding out how solid she was, whether she could be moved. She'd passed the test without knowing she was being tested. She wasn't sure that was the end of it. 3 weeks became a month, and the ranch began to feel different. Not dramatic, not transformed, just different in the way places feel when someone starts caring about them properly. The garden came back in the south corner. Not fully, but enough that there were actual green things growing where dead ones had been. She fixed the hinge on the kitchen door that had been dragging against the frame for what looked like years. She reorganized the food storage so that things that needed to be used first were at the front, and things that kept long were at the back. And Caleb came in one day and stood looking at the shelves for a moment before he said, without turning around, "That's better." She said, "The dried beans were behind the flour. By the time you got to them, they'd have gone off." "I know," he said. "I just never—" He stopped. "I just hadn't gotten to it." She understood what he'd stopped himself from saying. He hadn't gotten to it because there'd been no one to get to it with. A man alone on a ranch doesn't reorganize his shelves. He just works around what's wrong until wrong becomes normal. She knew that particular adjustment. She'd made it herself in the years after her parents died, after Martha got sick, after the money ran out and the choices narrowed to a set that all looked more or less the same shade of hard. She didn't say any of that. She just put the lid back on the jar she'd been checking and went back to the stove. Lily, for her part, had taken to the ranch with a thoroughness that Evelyn found both gratifying and slightly alarming. She was 8 months old now and pulling herself up on everything. Chair legs, the bottom of the kitchen table, Evelyn's skirt, Caleb's boot whenever he was stationary long enough. She had no opinion about what was appropriate to grab, and no interest in anyone's concerns on the matter. Caleb bore this with a patience that continued to surprise her. He never moved her away sharply. He never made that face, the face men made around babies when they didn't know what to do and didn't want to admit it. The frozen, vaguely panicked look. He just let her hold whatever she was holding until she let go herself, and occasionally looked down at her with an expression that Evelyn could only describe as serious. Like he was taking her seriously, like she was a person with views, not just a small, inconvenient creature that made noise. One afternoon she found him sitting on the porch steps with Lily in the dirt beside him, both of them looking at something on the ground. When she got closer, she saw it was a beetle, big, black, moving across the dirt with considerable purpose. "She's been watching it for 10 minutes, Caleb said. Evelyn leaned against the porch post. "And you've been watching her watch it?" "Somebody has to make sure she doesn't eat it." Lily turned around at the sound of Evelyn's voice, saw her, and immediately lost all interest in the beetle. She held both arms up. Caleb looked at the beetle, now moving away unobserved. 10 minutes, he said, with a resignation that sounded almost like wry humor. "Gone, just like that." Evelyn picked Lily up. "She has priorities." He stood, brushed the dirt off his jeans, and went back to work without further comment. But there had been something in his voice, that almost humor, drier than anything she'd heard from him before, and she turned it over in her mind for the rest of the afternoon because it felt like something new, like a door that had been shut a long time and had just, briefly, been opened an inch. It was Holt from the saloon who told her about the water. He came out to the ranch one Saturday morning, which was unusual enough that Evelyn noticed it from the garden before he'd even reached the house. He rode slowly, the way men ride when they're working out what to say. Caleb was in the barn. Evelyn came to the gate and said, "Mr. Holt?" "Miss Harper." He dismounted and tied his horse and turned his hat in his hands, which told her the news was not good. "Is Caleb around?" "I'll get him." She got him. Caleb came out of the barn with hay on his sleeve and the particular alertness he carried when something was off schedule. He looked at Holt and said, "What?" Holt told him about the survey. Apparently a former employee of Crow's had been drinking at the saloon 2 nights ago and had talked more than he'd meant to. About a man named Garrett from Pennsylvania who'd come through the territory 8 months ago, doing something with instruments that nobody understood. About a report Crow had paid considerable money to obtain, about what that report had found. "Water," Holt said. "Deep water." "A good source," the fella said. "Said Crow near about fell off his chair when he got the news." Caleb stood very still. "Where?" he said. Holt looked at him. "Under your land, Caleb." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happened when something you'd been vaguely worried about turned out to be worse than the worry. Evelyn watched Caleb's face. He didn't react the way most men would. He didn't curse, didn't move, didn't do that jaw-tightening thing she'd seen men do when they wanted to look controlled but weren't. He just absorbed it, stood in his own yard and let the information settle into him like water into dry earth. "How sure is Crow?" he said. "Sure enough to want the land bad." "And what's he planning to do about it?" Holt turned his hat again. "That I don't know. But that fella said Crow wasn't the patient type." He paused. "He made you 2 offers already, didn't he? Fair ones, on paper. He won't make a third." After Holt left, Caleb went back into the barn, and Evelyn stood in the yard for a moment and then followed him. He was at the far end, doing something with a bridle that didn't look like it actually needed doing. She leaned against the stall door and waited. "How long have you known he wanted the land?" she said. 2 years. "Did you know why?" "No." He worked the buckle on the bridle. "I thought he just wanted the acreage. Territory's filling up. Land's worth more than it was." He paused. "This is different." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her. "You don't have to be part of this. Whatever's coming." She held his gaze. "I live here," she said. "I know, but Mr. Wilder," she said it plainly. "I came to this territory with nothing, and you gave me work and a roof, and you drove my sick baby through the dark at midnight without making me feel like I owed you for it. I'm not leaving because something difficult might be coming." She paused. "I'm also not particularly good at being scared into things. Ask Gerald Foss if you can find him." He stared at her for a second. Then he made a sound that might, in better circumstances, have been a laugh. Short, rough, real. "All right," he said. "All right." He went back to the bridle. She went back to the house. But something had shifted again between them, more than an inch this time. A door properly opened. Young. Crow's first real move came 9 days later. She saw it from the kitchen window, 2 men she didn't recognize riding along the north fence line with what looked like wire cutters. Not sneaking exactly, but moving with the casual confidence of men who believed they weren't going to be stopped. She went to the barn. "There are men at the north fence." Caleb was already saddling. She watched him ride out and thought about what Holt had said. He won't make a third offer. She stood in the kitchen doorway and watched until she couldn't see him anymore, And then she turned around and looked at the house. The clean floor, the garden she'd coaxed back to life, the shelf of beans in the right order, Lily asleep in the back room, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not fear. She was past fear in that particular way you got past it when you'd been afraid enough times that it stopped being interesting. What she felt was something older and more useful. Anger. The fence had been cut in 3 places. Caleb rode back in the early afternoon with a face that was carefully neutral, which she was beginning to understand meant he was furious. "Any cattle get out?" she asked. "Not yet. I patched it." "He'll do it again." "Probably." He unsaddled the horse with quick, efficient movements. "This is how he works. He'll make things difficult, small things, things that are hard to prove in front of a judge, until the cost gets high enough that selling looks like the rational choice." "How long does that usually take?" "For a man running alone?" He paused. "Not long." She registered the word alone and the weight he'd put on it. She said, "You're not running alone." He looked at her over the horse's back. His expression was complicated in a way she couldn't fully read. Not uncomfortable exactly, but searching, like he was trying to figure out if she meant what she'd said. She meant it. "I'm going into town tomorrow," she said. "I need supplies anyway. While I'm there, I'd like to talk to some of the other ranchers." "About what?" "About whether Crow's been pushing on them too." He was quiet. The horse moved and he steadied it. "You think he has?" he said. "A man who wants water rights in dry territory isn't just pushing on one ranch," she said. "He's building a position. You're the biggest piece, but you're probably not the only piece." She paused. "If the others are being pressured, they'll be afraid to talk about it. But a woman asking neighborly questions is different from a rancher asking for allies." He was quiet for a long moment. "You'd be putting yourself in it," he said, "past where you are already." "I told you I live here." He studied her. Then he said, "Take the small wagon. The road east goes past the Halverson place. Margaret Halverson is a straight talker. If there's something to know, she'll tell you." She nodded. "And Evelyn." It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed it but didn't react. "Be careful around Crow's people. You've already talked to him once." She stopped. "How did you know about that?" "The woman at the general store told me." A pause. "She said you handled it well." She thought about the woman with the tight gray hair and the glasses on her forehead. "I didn't know she was watching." "She watches everything," he said. "Always has." He turned back to the horse. "Be careful anyway." Margaret Halverson was 63 years old and had been running her ranch since her husband died of a snake bite 11 years ago, and she had opinions about Victor Crow that she'd apparently been waiting some time to share with the right person. She sat Evelyn down at her kitchen table and poured coffee without asking whether she wanted it and said, "He's been after our east pasture for a year, said it was a fair offer. I told him I wasn't interested." She wrapped both hands around her mug. 2 months later, our well went bad." Evelyn looked up. "Bad how?" "Contaminated. Something in the water that made the cattle sick." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Took us 3 months to dig another well on the west side. Cost us a good portion of what we'd put aside for winter." She paused. "Nobody could prove anything." "But you think it was Crow?" "I think wells don't go bad on their own in this territory." She looked at Evelyn directly. "And I think a man who shows up 2 weeks after your well goes bad with another offer on your land is not a coincidence." Evelyn asked if she'd talked to anyone else about it. "Who's going to listen? The sheriff here is—" She stopped, chose her words. "The sheriff is a man who likes a quiet life." "What about the other ranchers?" Margaret looked at her for a moment. Then she got up and poured more coffee and sat back down. "The Breyer family lost 3 head of cattle to a fire in their north pasture last spring. They blamed lightning, but the Breyer boy told my son the fire started at the fence line, not in the field." She paused. "The Henley claim. Smaller operation, 2 brothers. They had a loan come due faster than they expected. Sold last November. Crow bought the note." Evelyn set her cup down. 3 ranches. 3 different kinds of pressure. All in the last 18 months. All on land surrounding the Wilder property. "He's building a perimeter," she said. Margaret looked at her. "What?" "He's buying up or pushing out everything around Caleb's land, so that when he finally moves on the Wilder ranch, there's no one left nearby who'd stand against him." She was thinking out loud. the pieces arranging themselves into a shape she didn't entirely like. If he controls everything on four sides, Caleb's land is just isolated. No neighbors to call on, no one to notice if things get worse. Margaret was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You're smarter than I expected." "People keep underestimating me," Evelyn said. "I've stopped being offended by it." Margaret looked at her with something that might have been respect. "What are you planning to do?" "I don't know yet, but I'd like to know which of the other ranchers still have their land and whether they'd be willing to talk." Margaret nodded slowly. "I can make some introductions." "I'd appreciate that." She drove back to the ranch that afternoon with more information than she'd gone out with and a feeling she recognized but hadn't felt in a long time. The feeling of a problem becoming visible. She couldn't fix something she couldn't see, but she could see it now, most of it. She told Caleb everything over supper. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was how he processed things. He took it in and turned it over before he said anything, and what he said was usually worth the wait. "He's been smarter than I gave him credit for," he said finally. "He's been patient," she said. "That's different from smart." "In this case, it amounts to the same thing." "Maybe." She set her fork down. "But patience runs out. He's been building this for 2 years at least. He's going to want to see results." She paused. "That means he'll move faster now, more directly." Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the table. "What would you do? If it were your decision?" She thought about it honestly, which meant she sat with the question long enough that the easy answers fell away and the real ones came up underneath. "I'd bring the other ranchers together," she said. "Not to confront him, not yet, but to show him that he's not dealing with isolated people anymore. That moving on one of us means dealing with all of us." She paused. "Right now he's powerful because everyone's afraid alone. Fear that's shared gets lighter." He looked at her for a moment. "You'd have to convince them it was worth the risk." "I know. Some of them are already beaten down." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "But I came here with a baby and $3 and a suitcase, and I asked a stranger for work, and here I am. I'm comfortable making an argument that frightened people don't know what they're capable of." He was quiet. Then he said, "All right. All right, we try it, or all right, you're thinking about it. All right, we try it." He stood and picked up his plate. "I know where the Halverson land meets ours on the ridge. She and I can meet there without going through town. Harder for Crow's people to watch." She hadn't told him about the meeting point. He was already 3 steps ahead. "Good," she said. He took his plate to the basin. She watched him wash it, which he still did every night, and she thought about how strange it was, how you could come to know a person through the small rituals of their daily life faster than through anything they told you about themselves. She knew more about Caleb Wilder from watching him wash a plate and hitch a horse and crouch down to a baby's level in the dirt than she would have learned from a year of conversation. She knew he was careful. She knew he was fair. She knew he was lonely in a way that had been going on long enough that he'd stopped naming it. She knew those things because she recognized them. She was not thinking about that. She was thinking about Victor Crow and land surveys and a perimeter being drawn around 160 acres of ground with good water underneath it. She was absolutely not thinking about anything else. Crow's second move came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. She was in town again, supplies, and a meeting Margaret Halverson had arranged with the Breyer family at the general store, when she saw Deke. She recognized him now, the man who'd met her at the train station, the flat eyes, the hat. He was standing across the street watching her without making any particular effort to hide it. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went into the store and didn't look back. But that evening, the minister's wife came to the ranch. Evelyn saw her coming down the road in a rented buggy and felt a small, precise alarm, because nothing good had ever started with a minister's wife arriving unannounced. She came to the door while Caleb was still out in the fields. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and explained, in the careful way of a person delivering a message they hadn't written, that there was some concern in town, about the arrangement at the Wilder Ranch, about the nature of it. A woman and a man, unmarried, living under the same roof. "People talk," the woman said. Her tone was apologetic, but not apologetic enough. Evelyn kept her face very still. "People talk about a lot of things," she said. "Some of them true." "Well, yes." The woman shifted. "I'm only saying it might be wise to consider—" "Who sent you?" Evelyn said. The woman blinked. No one sent me. I'm here as a Mrs. Pearson, Evelyn said it calmly. You let me sleep in your back room for one night and sent me away the next morning. I'm grateful for the night, but I don't believe you drove 12 miles out to this ranch to offer friendly concern without someone suggesting it was worth the trip. Mrs. Pearson's mouth opened and closed. Was it Victor Crow? Evelyn said. A pause. A fraction of a second too long. I don't know what you mean, the woman said. I think you do. Evelyn stood and went to the door and opened it because the conversation was over and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Thank you for coming out. After Mrs. Pearson's buggy had disappeared down the road, Evelyn stood on the porch and let the evening air move around her. Lily was inside, awake and vocal, talking to the wooden spoon she'd claimed as a toy. Caleb came in from the field 20 minutes later and found Evelyn still standing on the porch. What happened? He said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, then, he's trying to push you out. He's trying to make the situation uncomfortable enough that I leave, and without me here you're easier to isolate. She paused. He knows you're less settled with me gone. I think he's figured out that I've been talking to the other ranchers. How? Deke was watching me in town today. Caleb's jaw tightened. That jaw movement she'd seen exactly once before. Not rage, but a contained, focused anger that looked like it had a long history of being controlled. He won't move on you directly, Caleb said. That's not how he operates. He'll chip away, she said. I know. Evelyn. He said her name without the formality, the way you said a person's name when you wanted them to hear what you were actually saying. If this gets worse, don't, she said. I'm not trying to. You're about to tell me I can leave, she said. That it would be safer, that you don't want me to feel obligated. She turned to look at him properly. And I'm telling you not to, because I'm not here out of obligation, and I'm not going to leave out of fear, and if you tell me one more time that I don't have to be part of this, I'm going to say something you won't enjoy. He stared at her. She stared back. Something crossed his face that she'd never seen there before, not quite surprise, not quite relief. Something that lived between those things, in a place she didn't have a word for. All right, he said. Good, she said. She went inside to rescue Lily from the spoon situation, and Caleb stood on the porch alone for a minute before he followed her in. She was making supper when she heard him behind her and said, without turning around, The Halverson meeting. Can we do it this week? Thursday, he said. I'll get word to Margaret. And the Briars? I'll ride out tomorrow. I'll come with you. A pause. It's a long ride. I've told you how I feel about long rides. Another pause. Then, quietly, something that was definitely a laugh. Short, real, the second one she'd ever heard from him, and somehow more settled than the first. You have, he said. She put the pot on the stove and didn't smile, but it was a near thing. The meeting on the ridge happened on a cold Thursday morning with 8 people and a wind coming off the mountains that made everything feel sharp and exposed. Margaret Halverson stood with her arms crossed and her chin set. 2 of the Briar boys, young men, 20 and 23, with their father's stubbornness in their faces. A couple named Reyes, who ran a small operation to the south and had never given Crow an inch despite 2 offers. An older man named Purcell, who'd lost a barn to what the insurance company called accident and what he called deliberate. Caleb stood at the center of the group and told them what he knew. He spoke plainly, without drama, just facts set out in order the way you set out tools before a job. Water survey. 2 years of soft pressure. The Henley claim bought out. The pattern. When he finished, nobody spoke for a moment. Then one of the Briar boys said, "What do we do about it?" Everyone looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She hadn't planned that. She hadn't expected him to do it. But he looked at her with the particular directness he had. No performance in it, no deflection, and it was clearly not a question. It was a handoff. He was telling her she was the one with the answer. She stepped forward. "We make it expensive for him," she said. "Not violent. That's what he wants. He wants us to do something that lets him call in a sheriff and paint us as the problem." She looked around the group. "We document everything, every fence cut, every dead animal, every suspicious incident. We write it down with dates and witnesses, and we keep those records somewhere safe." She paused. "And we stop being afraid to be seen talking to each other. Right now, he counts on us being isolated. The moment we stop acting isolated, he loses half his leverage. Purcell said, he's got money and men and probably the sheriff in his pocket. He has those things, Evelyn agreed. And we have 8 people standing on a ridge who know what he's done and are tired of pretending otherwise. She looked at him directly. I came to this territory 6 weeks ago with nothing. I've learned since then that people who have nothing left to lose are a lot more trouble than people who have everything. She paused. We're not people with nothing. We have our land and each other. That's more than he thinks we have. The wind moved through the group. Somewhere below them a horse shifted. Margaret Halverson looked at Evelyn for a long moment. Then she said, I'm in. One by one, the others said the same. It wasn't a victory. It was the beginning of something that was going to get harder before it got easier, and she knew it, and she could see from their faces that they knew it too. But they were no longer standing alone on their individual pieces of ground. And Victor Crow, wherever he was, in whatever office, reading whatever ledger, did not yet know that the woman he'd tried to push off a train platform 6 weeks ago had just changed the terms of the problem he thought he'd already solved. The days after the Ridge meeting had a different quality to them. Not calmer, if anything the opposite, but more deliberate, the way a person moves differently when they've made a decision they intend to keep. Evelyn started the record book that same evening. She found a blank ledger in the back of the kitchen drawer, the kind used for household accounts, and she sat at the table after supper with Lily, asleep in the back room, and wrote down everything she could remember in order: dates, descriptions, names where she had them. The fence cuts. The men Caleb had chased off the north pasture. The visit from Mrs. Pearson, Deke watching her from across the street. She wrote it plainly, without embellishment, because plain facts were harder to argue with than emotional ones. Caleb came in while she was writing, looked at the ledger without commenting, poured himself a glass of water, and sat down across from her. Margaret's going to start keeping one too, Evelyn said without looking up. I asked her to. And I gave the Briar boys a piece of paper with what to write down and how. Dates and witnesses, he said. Dates and witnesses. If we ever get in front of a judge, a real judge, not whoever Crow has in his pocket locally. This is what matters. She looked up. Do you know anyone outside this territory? A lawyer or someone with connections to a county court? He thought about it. I knew a man in Tucson. We did some business 5 or 6 years ago. He's not a lawyer, but he knows people. He paused. I don't know if he'd want to get involved. Would he be willing to hear from you? Maybe. He turned the glass in his hands. I'd have to write out. Not yet, she said, but soon. I want to have more in the ledger before we reach out to anyone external. We need it to look like what it is, a pattern, not a grudge. He nodded slowly. She went back to writing. After a while, he said, You think like a lawyer. She didn't look up. I grew up with a father who lost a land dispute because he didn't know how to document his own claims. The other man had a lawyer and a ledger. My father had his word. She finished the line she was on. I decided a long time ago I wouldn't make the same mistake. He was quiet for a moment. How old were you? 12. He didn't offer sympathy, which she appreciated. He just said, good instinct at 12, and finished his water and went to bed. She stayed up another hour, writing. Crow's next move came not against the ranch, but against Evelyn directly. She was at the general store on a Wednesday, the usual supplies, and a quiet word with the woman at the counter, whose name she'd learned was Ruth, and who had turned out to be one of the more useful sources of information in Red Hollow, having spent 30 years behind that counter watching the town conduct its business. When she overheard 2 women talking near the fabric bolts, she knew they'd seen her come in. She was fairly certain they were speaking loudly enough for her to hear on purpose. Don't know where she came from exactly. Pennsylvania, someone said, or Ohio. And the baby's not even hers. No husband, no family here, just shows up and moves in with a man she'd never met. Well, a pause loaded with implication. Some women know how to make themselves useful. Evelyn kept her face still and continued reading the list in her hand. Ruth, behind the counter, made a sound like a cork being pulled from a very tight bottle, which was apparently the closest she got to expressing outrage. You need anything else, Miss Harper? Ruth said, clearly and deliberately. Just the flour, Evelyn said. Thank you, Ruth. She collected her supplies and left. On the steps outside, she stood in the heat for a moment and thought carefully about what she was feeling, which was useful because what she was feeling told her something about what was happening. It wasn't shame. She'd examined it carefully, and it wasn't shame. She had nothing to be ashamed of, and she knew it, and the knowing was solid. What it was, more precisely, was a kind of tired recognition. She'd seen this before, this particular way that women got used as weapons against other women, and men who wanted to destroy something used talk and reputation and whisper because it cost them nothing and it was almost impossible to fight. Victor Crow hadn't said a word, but she'd bet everything in her ledger that he'd said something to someone who'd said something to someone else, and here they were. She drove back to the ranch and thought about it the whole way. That evening, she told Caleb. He listened. His expression went through something she was learning to read. That controlled quiet that meant he was angrier than he looked. "I'm going to go talk to Crow," he said. "No," she said. "Evelyn, no." She said it firmly. "That's what he wants. He wants you to do something reactive that he can point to. He wants to make this about you losing your temper, not about him pressuring your neighbors and cutting your fences." She leaned forward. "If you go in there angry, he wins that conversation before it starts." Caleb said nothing. His jaw was set. "I know it's hard," she said. And she meant it. She could see it was hard, that the anger in him was the kind that came from wanting to protect something and feeling like he couldn't. "But the ledger is working. We have 6 documented incidents in 4 weeks across 3 properties. That's a pattern. Patterns are what move judges." The sheriff is not our next move." She held his gaze. "Tucson is. The man you mentioned." He exhaled, looked at the table, looked back at her. "His name's Aldrich," he said. "Thomas Aldrich. He runs a land title office. Honest man, or was." "Can you write to him this week?" "I can write out to the telegraph station in Millfield, faster than a letter." "Good." He went the next morning before dawn and was back by noon. The reply came 2 days later. Aldrich remembered Caleb, was interested in what he'd heard, and would be in the territory in 3 weeks on other business, and could stop in Red Hollow if it was useful. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks to keep the situation stable and the ledger growing, and then they'd have someone outside the territory looking at what they'd built. Evelyn wrote the date in the ledger and told herself 3 weeks was manageable. She was wrong, but not in the ways she'd expected. The fire started on a Saturday night. She smelled it before she heard anything, that particular quality of smoke that wasn't wood smoke, that had something sharper underneath it, and she was out of bed before she was fully awake, moving on instinct, grabbing Lily from the cot in the same motion. The north section of the barn was burning. She came out onto the porch, and the sky in that direction was orange, and Caleb was already there. She didn't know how he'd gotten there before her. He must have smelled it too. And he was at the barn door pulling horses out, and she stood for one fractured second watching him before she understood what she needed to do. She put Lily down on the porch in the corner where she'd stay and ran to the water barrel. The bucket. She knew where the bucket was. She'd filled it that morning. She ran back and forth with the bucket 11 times before her arms stopped feeling like her own. The fire hadn't reached the hay yet. That was what they were fighting. The edge of the wall, keeping it from getting to the hay. And Caleb worked beside her and twice grabbed the bucket himself when she stumbled and kept going. And they were both soaked in black with soot when the fire finally stopped having anywhere left to go. She stood in the dirt with her hands on her knees and breathed. The north wall was gone. The rest of the barn was standing. The horses were in the yard, agitated but alive. Lily was crying on the porch. Evelyn went to her, picked her up, held her against her chest. Caleb came to stand beside her. He was black to the elbows, and his shirt was burned through in one place at the shoulder, and he was breathing hard. "It started at the base of the wall," he said, "outside, where no lamp gets near." She said, "I know." They stood in the dark with the smoking barn behind them, and the horses moving in the yard, and Lily clutched against Evelyn's chest, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there wasn't anything to say that the situation hadn't already said. This was no longer small pressure. Fence cuts and whisper campaigns were harassment. A barn fire at night was something else. She wrote it in the ledger the next morning with hands that were still slightly unsteady. Saturday night, approximate time, point of origin, condition of the wall afterward. She wrote deliberate ignition, external wall, no lamp access, and she wrote it in capital letters because she wanted anyone who read it to understand this was not a guess. Caleb went into town that same day, and she asked him to go to Ruth at the general store first. Ruth had not been in the original group on the ridge. She wasn't a rancher, and Evelyn hadn't thought to include her, but she'd been at that counter for 30 years, and she'd seen Crow come up in this town from nothing, and she had views. When Caleb, he said Ruth had told him that Deke and another man had been drinking late at the saloon Saturday night, and that they'd both left before midnight, and neither had been seen again that evening. He said Ruth had also said she'd be willing to write down what she knew in a statement if it ever came to that. She said to tell you she's not afraid of Victor Crow, Caleb said. Said she's been not afraid of him for years and just needed someone to be not afraid alongside. Evelyn looked at the ledger. We're getting there, she said. We're also running out of time, he said. Aldrich isn't here yet, and Crow isn't slowing down. I know. He sat down across from her. I want you to think about whether you and Lily should stay with Margaret for a while, until Aldrich comes. She looked at him. Not because I want you gone, he said, and it came out with more directness than she thought he'd intended. Because if he decides to escalate again, a barn fire at night is not a place to have a baby. She was quiet for a moment. It was a fair point, and she knew it was a fair point, which was the irritating thing about Caleb Wilder. He made fair points at inconvenient times. She can stay with Margaret, Evelyn said. I'm staying here. That's not what I... Lily is safer with Margaret for now, yes. I agree with you on that. She met his eyes. But I'm not leaving this ranch, and I'm not leaving you here alone to deal with whatever comes next. She paused. We already had this conversation. He pressed his mouth together, looked at the table. We did, he said. Yes. He nodded, slow and reluctant. I'll ride Lily out to Margaret's tomorrow. I'll pack her things tonight. She said it steadily, and she meant it steadily, and it was only later, after he'd gone out to check the horses, and she was folding Lily's small blanket into the bag, that she let herself feel for one moment how hard it was to put that blanket in that bag. How strange, how wrong it felt to separate from her, even to somewhere safer, even for the right reasons. She put the blanket in the bag and closed the clasp, and told herself it was the correct decision. It was. That didn't make it easy. With Lily at Margaret's, the ranch got quieter in a way Evelyn hadn't anticipated. Not peaceful, something tighter than peaceful. She and Caleb moved through the days with the focus of people who'd stripped away everything unnecessary and were down to the work. She rode out to visit Lily every other day. Margaret had taken to the baby with the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who'd raised 4 children and knew exactly what to do with an 8-month-old and didn't need anyone to tell her. Lily was fine. Better than fine. She was already trying to pull herself up on Margaret's chair legs with the same relentless determination she brought to everything. On one of those afternoon visits, while Lily slept and she and Margaret sat on the porch, Margaret said, "You know he's going to come after you personally." "He already has," Evelyn said. "The talk in town." "That's not what I mean." Margaret held her coffee mug in both hands the way she always did, like the warmth of it mattered. "I mean, he's going to find something in your past to use, or make something up. With a woman alone, it's usually one or the other." She paused. "Is there anything he could find?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "My sister. She died of something people in certain company consider shameful." She paused. The circumstances weren't simple. "And Lily's father?" "Unknown. Martha didn't say, and I didn't press." Margaret nodded. "If he finds that, or something like it, he'll use it to say you're not fit to raise her." Evelyn felt the statement land somewhere cold in her chest. "He can say it," she said. "Doesn't make it true." "No, but it can make enough people uncertain enough to... Margaret stopped, set the cup down. "I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it because I think you should be prepared." "I am," Evelyn said, "or I'm getting there." She drove back to the ranch that evening with the landscape going orange and flat around her, and she thought about Martha, about the last year of Martha's life, which had been a series of choices that Evelyn had disagreed with and been afraid of and ultimately stood beside, because standing beside was what you did when someone was your blood and your person and the only family you had left. Martha had made bad decisions. She had also been funny and sharp, and she had loved Lily from the moment she was born with a totality that frightened her a little, and she had died at 27 of something preventable if she'd had more money and better options, and Evelyn had been the one who held her hand at the end and promised to take care of the baby. She had kept that promise across 1,100 miles and a life dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. Victor Crow was not going to take Lily from her using Martha's story as a weapon. She would not allow it. She didn't know yet exactly how she was going to stop it, but the not knowing was temporary, and she was very good at solving temporary problems. Aldrich arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 12 days after the fire, a week earlier than expected. He was a compact man, 50s, with a gray beard trimmed short, and the careful eyes of someone who spent his professional life reading documents for what they didn't say. He came in a rented buggy, alone, and when Caleb met him at the gate, there was the particular ease between them of men who'd done honest business together and trusted the experience. He sat at the kitchen table and read through the ledger slowly, from the first page to the last, without saying anything. Evelyn had made coffee, and she poured it and sat across from him and let him read. Caleb stood near the window. When Aldrich finished, he closed the ledger and looked up. "This is good work," he said. He said it to Evelyn, not to Caleb, because she'd written most of it, and he'd evidently noticed the handwriting shift when Caleb had added his entries. "Thank you," she said. "The barn fire is the strongest incident. External ignition, documented the morning after, corroborated by your observation of the wall and the departure of Crow's men from the saloon that same night." He tapped the page. "Individually, any of this is arguable. Together it forms a pattern that a county judge with integrity would find interesting." He paused. "A county judge without integrity would not." "How do we find one with integrity?" Caleb said. "You go to Tucson. There's a circuit judge named Harlan who covers this district every 3 months. He's not in anyone's pocket that I've been able to identify, and I've been looking because I've dealt with Crow's land acquisitions on the title side before." He looked at Caleb. "He bought the Henley note. Did you know that?" "I knew he bought the land. He bought the debt first, then called it due when the Henleys couldn't pay. Technically legal. In practice," Aldrich made a short sound, "he's done it twice in the last 18 months. There's a woman over in Millfield whose husband borrowed against their property, and Crow bought the note before the man even knew it had been sold." He closed his notebook. "He's building an operation. The water on your land is the centerpiece, but it's not the only piece. He wants to control water access across a 50-mile radius." "And if he does," Evelyn said, "then every rancher, every farmer, every small operation in this territory pays him for the right to survive." Aldrich said it bluntly. "He's not land-grabbing for the land. He's building a monopoly." The words sat on the table between them. She'd understood most of it already, but hearing it laid out that plainly made it feel different, larger, more consequential than one ranch, one water survey, one woman trying to hold a household together. "What do we need to do?" she said. "3 things. Aldrich held up a finger. "First, get your documentary evidence in front of Judge Harlan before Crow does. He'll have his own version ready, I guarantee it, but yours is more credible because it's contemporaneous and multi-sourced." Another finger. "Second, keep the other ranchers in your coalition visible and united. Isolated complaints are easy to dismiss. 8 landowners with corroborating accounts are harder." He paused. "Third," he looked at her carefully, "prepare for him to attack your personal credibility. He'll do it. He always does it when the direct route is blocked." She held his gaze. "I know. Do you have anything in your background that my sister's death, the circumstances around it, and the fact that I'm raising a child who isn't legally mine, whose parentage is undocumented?" Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "He could use that to challenge your standing. Your right to speak on behalf of the Wilder property, your fitness to be the guardian of the child." He paused. "How solid is your arrangement with Caleb?" The question had a weight to it that she felt but ignored. "I'm employed here. I maintain his household." "Do you have any documentation of that arrangement?" She looked at Caleb. He hadn't moved from the window. His expression was unreadable in the particular way it got when something was being discussed that he'd been thinking about separately. "We have a verbal agreement," Evelyn said, "that can be challenged." Aldrich said it carefully, not unkindly. "A woman living on a man's property with a verbal arrangement and no documentation is, in the eyes of a court, or in the eyes of a man trying to make her look like something she's not, difficult to defend cleanly." The room was quiet. Then Caleb said from the window, There's another arrangement we could make. She turned to look at him. He was looking at Aldrich, not at her, but his jaw had that set quality she knew. Now meant he'd been thinking about something for long enough that saying it out loud was not impulsive. It was deliberate. "What arrangement?" she said. Her voice was level. He looked at her then. "Legal, formal. Documentation that this is your home and your place, and nobody can question your right to be here." He said it with the same directness he brought to everything. No performance, no decoration. "If you were willing." She understood what he was saying. She understood it precisely and completely, and she sat with it for a moment that felt longer than it was. "That's a significant step," she said. "I know. For reasons that have nothing to do with Crow." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "But it's not a step I'm suggesting only because of Crow." Aldrich was looking at the ledger with the focused interest of a man who'd decided to be somewhere else in his attention while two people said something that needed to be said privately. She thought about Caleb in the barn at midnight with his hands on a horse's bridle doing something that didn't need doing. She thought about him crouching in the dirt to the level of a beetle and a baby. She thought about the way he'd said alone when he'd meant something more than the word. She thought about all the things she hadn't let herself look at directly. "We should talk about it," she said. "Not right now, with Thomas sitting here." Aldrich made a sound that was clearly a suppressed laugh. "I can step outside," he said. "No." She almost smiled. "Finish what you were saying. We'll talk later." Aldrich nodded and went back to his list of what needed to happen before Judge Harlan's next circuit. She wrote it down in the back of the ledger. She wrote carefully, and her handwriting was steady, and she did not look at Caleb again until Aldrich had finished, and when she finally did, he was looking out the window, and the afternoon light was falling across his face in a way that made him look less armored than usual. Less armored, more himself. She looked away again and told herself to think about Judge Harlan. She'd expected. Not another fire. Not fence cuts. He'd apparently decided that incremental pressure was too slow and had shifted to something more aggressive. Two things happened in the same day. In the morning, she went to collect Lily from Margaret's, and Margaret met her at the gate with a face that meant news. A man had been through the day before, not Deke, someone different, better dressed, asking questions about Lily, who her parents were, whether there was documentation of the child's birth, whether Evelyn had any legal authority to act as guardian. He had the manner of a lawyer, Margaret said, but not the kind that works for honest people. Evelyn felt that cold thing settle in her chest again. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to get off my property." Margaret paused. "But he'd been to the minister first, and apparently Mrs. Pearson has been talking." So he'd found Martha's story, or enough of it. She held Lily tighter than usual on the ride back, which Lily objected to by grabbing a fistful of her hair and pulling, which was clarifying in its way. The second thing happened that afternoon. A rider came from town with a message, not delivered by hand. He just left it at the gatepost and rode away, which told her it was the kind of message people didn't want to be associated with delivering. It was a notice, typed, formal, citing a county ordinance she'd never heard of. It stated that the living arrangement at the Wilder property was under review by the County Moral Welfare Office, a body she was not sure actually existed, and that a formal inquiry would be conducted within 30 days. She read it twice and then went to find Caleb. He read it once and set it on the table. "Moral Welfare Office," he said. "I've never heard of it either. It may not be a real body. It may be something Crow had created on paper recently." She sat down. "But it doesn't matter if it's real or not. The inquiry process itself is the weapon. If there's a formal inquiry into this household that goes on record, a judge reviewing our complaint against him sees an ongoing inquiry into our household. It muddies everything." Caleb looked at the notice. "How fast can we respond?" "Aldrich is still in the territory. He said he'd be in Millfield for another week." She paused. "But that's not the only response." He looked at her. She met his eyes. "We should talk," she said. "About what you said in front of Aldrich." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant what I said." "I know you did." She folded her hands on the table. "I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is the only thing that works between us, and I don't intend to stop now." She looked at him directly. "If I agree to what you're suggesting, it cannot be only because of Crow. I won't do something permanent and significant for a temporary strategic reason. That's not fair to either of us. He nodded slowly. I agree with that. So I need you to tell me, honestly, without trying to protect me from the answer, what else it is for you. She paused. Because you said it wasn't only about Crow. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. He was looking at the table with that expression she'd learned to read, the one that meant he was taking something out that had been stored somewhere careful and looking at it in the light. You stayed, he said finally. That sounds simple, but it isn't. He looked up. Everyone I've had here has left. My hired man. Before that, my brother. The woman I... He stopped, started again. I stopped expecting people to stay. I built everything here for a life that was just me, because that was what I had, and what I thought I deserved. He paused. You got off a train with a baby, and $3, and you refused to be afraid, and you stayed, and you made this place. He stopped again, like the words weren't quite the right shape for what he meant. You made it feel like something worth coming home to. The kitchen was very quiet. She sat with what he'd said and felt it settle. And she thought about Harrisburg and the long nights after Martha died, and the particular specific loneliness of being a person who holds everything together for everyone else, and has no one holding anything for them. I wasn't raised to believe I deserved much, she said. A roof and enough to eat. Maybe that was ambitious. She paused. I came here believing I was being practical, a practical arrangement for a practical woman. She looked at him. I don't think it's only practical anymore. He held her gaze. No, he said, it's not. The notice from the Moral Welfare Office sat on the table between them, which was not the most romantic thing, and she was aware of the absurdity of it, and from the slight shift in his expression, she thought he was too. We should go to Aldrich tomorrow, she said, together, and we should get the documentation sorted. We should, he said, and then I need to get back out to the ridge. She sat straighter. Because Crow's lawyer asking about Lily means he's preparing to use her as leverage. And if he's willing to threaten a child's custody to get a land deal, there are things the other ranchers need to know. She paused. He's not just a bully, he's dangerous. And people who are afraid of dangerous men need to understand that staying afraid is more dangerous. Caleb looked at her for a moment. You're going to stand up in front of the town, aren't you? She hadn't said it, hadn't even fully formed it yet. But hearing him say it, she realized it was true, had been moving toward being true since the minute she'd stood on that ridge and watched 8 frightened people straighten their spines. Yes, she said. I think I am. He nodded, not surprised, not alarmed, just receiving it. Then we'd better have everything in order before you do, he said, because once you put yourself that visible, he'll come at you with everything he has. I know, she said. She looked at the notice on the table and then at the ledger on the shelf, and then at Caleb, who had driven through the dark at midnight for a baby that wasn't his, and who had sat alone in a way that meant something more, and who was looking back at her now with the kind of steadiness she had spent her whole life believing was too much to ask for. She was not going to let Victor Crow take any of this. Not the land, not the ledger, not the life she'd started to believe, cautiously, and against all her better instincts, she might actually deserve. She was done being cautious about that. The rest of it, what was coming, how bad it would get before it was over, she'd face that when it arrived. She was good at that. She'd been practicing her whole life. They rode to Millfield the next morning before the heat set in, Evelyn on the seat beside Caleb with the ledger wrapped in oilcloth on her lap, and the notice from the Moral Welfare Office folded in her coat pocket. Neither of them had said much since the night before, not because things were unresolved between them, if anything the opposite, but because some things, once said, needed a little time to settle before you could talk around them normally again. Aldrich was at the land title office on Millfield's Main Street, a narrow room with good light and stacks of documents organized in a way that told her he took his work seriously. He looked up when they came in together and registered something in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. She put the notice on his desk without preamble. He read it again, set it down. The Southwest County Moral Welfare Office, he said. That's not a standing body. It's a provision in the territorial code that allows a temporary review panel to be convened at the request of a county official. Rarely used, rarely even remembered. He looked up. Which means Crow has either a lawyer who knows the territorial code very well, or a county official in his pocket willing to convene it. Or both, Caleb said. Or both. Aldrich leaned back in his chair. The review wouldn't have enforcement power on its own. It would have to make a finding and refer that finding to a judge. But if he can get a finding on record before you get your complaint in front of Harlan, it creates interference. A judge seeing a moral welfare review of a household that's also filing a harassment complaint tends to look at both with more caution. He's muddying the water, Evelyn said. That's exactly what he's doing. Aldrich looked at her. How quickly can you two get your documentation formalized? We were hoping you could help us with that today, she said. He looked between them. Both things? Both things, Caleb said. Aldrich nodded slowly, reached for a blank sheet of paper, and uncapped his pen. Tell me what you need. They spent 2 hours in that office. The employment documentation was straightforward. A written agreement specifying terms of work and compensation backdated to the date of the verbal arrangement, signed by both of them and witnessed by Aldrich. That established Evelyn's formal role in the household, which undercut the implication that her presence there was something other than what it was. The second document took longer and required more from both of them. Aldrich asked questions carefully, and she answered them carefully, and Caleb answered the ones directed at him, and at the end of it, there was a formal record that meant whatever Crow's lawyer brought to a review panel would run headfirst into paperwork that told a different and more durable story. When it was done, she signed where Aldrich indicated. Caleb signed beside her. Aldrich signed as witness and pressed his seal into the wax. She looked at the documents on the desk and thought about Martha, about the promise she'd made at the end, about the 1,100 miles and the $3 and the train platform in the desert heat. About all of it. I kept the promise, she thought, and then some. One more thing, Aldrich said. He pulled a separate sheet toward him. I'm writing to Judge Harlan's clerk today to request an expedited hearing date. I'll cite the moral welfare notice as the reason. It's actually useful to us because it demonstrates Crow is actively trying to interfere with your ability to seek relief. He looked at Caleb. How soon can you get all your coalition ranchers to make written statements? A week, Caleb said. I need them in 10 days. I'll be back in Tucson by then. He paused. And Evelyn, he said her name with the ease of someone who'd decided formality was no longer the right register. What you said last night about standing up publicly. I want you to think carefully about the timing. Not whether to do it. I think you're right that it's necessary. But when? He held her gaze. Do it before Harlan schedules the hearing and it looks like performance. Do it after. If we don't get the outcome we need, it could be the thing that changes the conversation in this territory permanently. She understood what he meant. Keep it in reserve. For now, yes. She nodded. All right. They drove back to Red Hollow in the afternoon, and the landscape looked the same as it always did, flat and gold and hard under the sun. But she felt different sitting in it, more anchored, like something that had been uncertain had been made certain, and certainty, even in a hard situation, was a better thing to move from than its absence. Caleb drove and didn't say much, which was normal, but twice she caught him looking at the road with an expression she recognized now as something like settled, like a man who'd put something down he'd been carrying a long time. She knew the feeling. The week that followed was the busiest she could remember since the days right after Martha died, when everything needed doing at once, and there was no time to feel any of it until it was done. She wrote out to each of the coalition ranchers in turn, Margaret, the Breyer boys, the Reyes family, old Purcell, and 2 others who'd joined after the Ridge meeting, and she sat at each kitchen table and explained what was needed. A written statement, specific, dated, what happened, when, any witnesses. She brought blank paper and a good pen, and she sat with them while they wrote, and when they got stuck, she asked questions that helped them remember the right details without telling them what to say. Most of them had never written a legal statement before. That showed, in different ways. Purcell wrote his in a large, slow script that was almost entirely feelings, and she had to gently ask him 3 times to bring it back to facts. Younger Breyer boy, the 20-year-old, whose name was Clem, wrote his in a rush with the pen pressed too hard, like the pressure in his chest was coming out through his hand. And what he produced was angry but precise, and she told him it was good because it was. Margaret wrote hers in 15 minutes and handed it across the table without comment, and Evelyn read it and looked up and said, "You've done this before." I testified in a land dispute 20 years ago, Margaret said. Different county. I lost, but I learned how to write a statement. This one's better than losing, Evelyn said. It better be, Margaret said, and poured more coffee. She had 9 statements in 8 days. She sent them to Aldrich by courier, paid for with money from the household account that she noted carefully in the ledger, because everything got documented now. Everything. And his reply came back 4 days later confirming receipt and telling her Judge Harlan's clerk had responded and a date was being set. 3 weeks out. Maybe less. She wrote that in the ledger, too. Crow knew something was happening. She could tell because the quality of his pressure changed. He'd pulled back the open harassment. No more fence cuts, no riders on the property line, nothing visible. Which was, she'd learned, more alarming than the visible things, because it meant he was recalculating. Moving pieces she couldn't see yet. Ruth at the general store told her that Crow had been spending more time in town than usual, that he'd been seen at the sheriff's office twice, that his lawyer, the well-dressed man who'd asked Margaret questions about Lily, had been seen at the county clerk's office going through records. What kind of records? Evelyn asked. Birth records, Ruth said, and property filings. Birth records meant Lily. Property filings meant the Wilder Ranch. She told Caleb that evening and watched his face do that controlled fury thing. He's building his case, she said, before Harlan arrives. What does he need from the birth records? He's looking for documentation of Lily's parentage, or the absence of it. She paused. Martha registered the birth in Harrisburg, but the father's line is blank. He'll use that to argue that the child's legal situation is unresolved and that my guardianship is informal at best. She looked at the table. He'll say I'm a woman of uncertain character raising a child of uncertain origins in a household that was, until recently, undocumented. Caleb was quiet. The documentation helps, she said. Aldrich's work helps. But if he gets in front of Harlan first with that framing, she stopped. He's good at framing. I'll give him that. What do we do? She'd been thinking about this since Ruth had told her about the birth records. She'd turned it over for 3 days, and the answer she kept arriving at was the same one, and she didn't entirely like it because it required something she didn't give easily. I need to tell you about Martha, she said. Everything. Not the version I give people, but the real one. She looked at him. Because if Crow gets in front of Harlan with what he's found, you should not be surprised by any of it. And because... She stopped. Because I'm tired of managing what people know about me. It's exhausting, and I'm done with it. He held her gaze and said simply, All right. She told him. All of it. Martha at 22, bright and stubborn and terrible at choosing men, which was a family trait that Evelyn had overcompensated for in the other direction. The man who'd left when Martha got pregnant. The year that followed, which had been genuinely hard. Not hardship in a story hard, but the grinding real kind where choices are between bad and worse. The thing Martha had gotten into to make enough money, which she had done without shame, and which had killed her slowly in ways that took 2 years to become visible. Evelyn told it plainly, the way she'd written the ledger. Facts in order. No embellishment in either direction. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She loved the baby. More than anything, Evelyn said. That part was never complicated. Then that's what matters. She looked at him. You understand that Crow is going to use this. I understand. And it won't... She stopped because she didn't entirely know how to finish the sentence. No, he said. It was simple, and it covered whatever she'd been trying to ask. It won't, she breathed out. Long and slow, the way you breathed when you'd been holding something for a long time. All right, she said. All right. 10 days before the hearing date, Aldrich had confirmed Crow made the move she'd been waiting for. It came in the form of a public notice posted on the board outside the sheriff's office. A common enough practice for legal proceedings, required by territorial code, which meant it was technically legitimate and practically impossible to object to. The notice announced that a formal inquiry into the welfare of a minor child residing at or associated with the Wilder property would be conducted by the Southwest County Review Panel on a date 4 days before Judge Harlan's scheduled hearing. 4 days before. It was precise, deliberate. She stood outside the sheriff's office and read it and felt the shape of what he was doing very clearly. He would get his panel, whatever combination of compliant officials and appointed men he could assemble, to produce a finding about Lily's situation. He would have that finding in hand when Harlan arrived. He would present it as evidence that the people filing the harassment complaint were themselves the subject of an ongoing welfare inquiry. He would make them look like the problem. She took the notice down, which she was entitled to do after reading it, and folded it and put it in her pocket and went to find Caleb. He was at the livery getting the wagon wheel reset. He looked up when she came in and read her face before she said anything. She handed him the notice. He read it, set it down on the wagon seat. 4 days before Harlan, he said. Yes. He looked at the notice, looked at her. What do you need? I need to talk to Aldrich by telegraph today, and I need to talk to Margaret. She paused. And I need to know whether the sheriff is actually in Crow's pocket or just inclined toward a quiet life. Second one, Caleb said. Sheriff Beale is not a corrupt man. He's a careful one. There's a difference. Can you talk to him? I can try. Good. She picked up the notice. And I need Clem Breyer. Caleb looked at her. Clem, why? Because he's 20 years old and he's furious and he has a memory for detail, and there's something I need him to do in town that he'll be better at than either of us. She paused. I need eyes on the county clerk's office, on who goes in and out and what they're carrying. Crow is filing things. I want to know what. Caleb nodded. I'll send for him. She spent the rest of the day in motion. The telegraph to Aldrich went out at noon and his reply came back by 4, terse and useful. 3 lines telling her what the territorial code allowed in terms of challenging a panel composition and how quickly that challenge had to be filed. She wrote down the numbers and folded the paper into the ledger. Caleb spoke to Sheriff Beale that afternoon. He came home and said Beale had listened and hadn't committed to anything, but he'd asked 2 questions that were the right questions and had written something in his notebook. He's not going to actively help us, Caleb said, but he might not actively help Crow either. That's enough for now, she said. Neutral is useful. Clem Breyer showed up the next morning with his brother and Evelyn pulled him aside and told him what she needed. He listened with the focused attention of a young man who understood that being given a real job meant he was being trusted with something that mattered. Don't confront anyone, she said. Don't make it visible. You're just a rancher's boy who happens to be in town running errands. You hear things, you see things, you write them down, and you bring the paper to me. Yes, ma'am, he said. And Clem. She held his gaze. Don't do anything brave. Brave is not what I need from you right now. I need observant. He nodded. She could see he was slightly disappointed that brave was off the table, but was mature enough to accept it. He came back 2 days later with 3 pages of close written notes, and what he'd written changed everything. Well, he'd seen the lawyer, Crow's man, the well-dressed one, come out of the county clerk's office with a folder that was too thick for routine filings. He'd noted the time. He'd also noted that the same man had stopped at the hotel and met with 2 others who Clem had followed, at a distance, to the livery, where he'd overheard enough of their conversation to understand they were the 2 men being appointed to the review panel. That wasn't the part that changed everything. The part that changed everything was what else Clem had seen. At the back of the county clerk's building, coming out through a side door, was a man Clem didn't recognize, tucked older, in traveling clothes, with a survey case over one shoulder. Clem had described him in detail: medium height, gray hat, a leather case with brass fittings, moving quickly like a man who didn't want to be noticed. Evelyn read the description twice. Garrett, she said. Caleb looked up. What? The man from Pennsylvania, the surveyor Holt mentioned, the one Crow paid for the water survey. She looked at the notes. Why would Crow's surveyor be going into the county clerk's office 2 weeks before a hearing? Caleb was quiet. He's filing the survey, she said. He's making the water rights claim official, before Harlan arrives. She sat back. If Crow gets the water rights claim on record before we get our complaint in front of a judge, the complaint becomes secondary. The court's primary question becomes water rights, not harassment, and that's a question where Crow has more resources and more legal infrastructure than we do. She looked at Caleb. He was already thinking, she could see it. We need Aldrich here, he said. Not by telegraph. Here. Yes. She was already standing. I'll go. Evelyn, it's a day's ride. I'll go today and come back tomorrow. She was at the door. Can you get word to Margaret and the others? Tell them to be ready. I don't know what ready means yet, but tell them to be ready. I'll go to Margaret tonight. He stood. Take the better horse, not the wagon. You'll make better time. She nodded. And be careful coming back through the South Pass, he said. It's not dangerous, just slow in the dark. She looked at him. He was giving her practical information, which was how he said things that weren't entirely practical. I'll be careful, she said. She rode to Millfield in under 4 hours, found Aldrich at the hotel where he'd been staying to finish up his territory business, and sat down across from him in the dining room and told him everything Clem had written. Aldrich listened without interrupting and then said, "The survey filing?" "Yes." "When?" Clem saw him Tuesday. Today is Thursday. If it filed Tuesday, it's already in the record. He was thinking she could see it. The particular focused stillness of someone working through something with trained speed. The good news is that a water rights claim is not self-executing. It has to be reviewed and confirmed. That review is a separate proceeding from the harassment complaint, but they can be... He paused. They can be addressed together in front of a sufficiently motivated judge. Is Harlan sufficiently motivated? Harlan is a man who doesn't like being managed, Aldrich said. If we can show him that Crow has been filing things strategically to get ahead of a legitimate complaint, he'll take that personally. He paused. We need to file a response to the water rights claim, today, and we need to attach the survey documentation from our side. Do you know if there's been any counter-survey done on the Wilder property? No. Is there time to... He stopped. No, there isn't. He picked up his pen. Then we file a response challenging the procedural validity of the original survey, that it was conducted without the landowner's knowledge or consent, and we request that any determination on water rights be deferred until after the harassment complaint is heard. He looked at her. That gives Harlan a reason to sequence things in our favor. And the review panel? The one Crow's convening on Lily? Aldrich set down the pen. That one I want to challenge on composition grounds. The territorial code requires that at least one panel member be a neutral party with no financial or professional connection to either interested party. If the 2 men Clem saw at the livery are who I think they might be, there are 2 men in this territory who do this kind of appointed work for whoever pays them, then I can file an objection that delays the panel for at least 10 days. Which puts it after Harlan's hearing. He looked at her steadily. This only works if we move fast, very fast. I know, she said. What do you need from me? Sleep somewhere tonight. I need you sharp tomorrow. We'll ride back to Red Hollow together in the morning, and I'll file from there. She almost argued. The instinct to keep moving, to not rest when there was still work to do, was strong in her. But she recognized the truth of what he was saying. She was tired in the bone-deep way that made you miss things, and she couldn't afford to miss things right now. All right, she said. Morning. She slept in a hotel room that smelled like cedar and old wool, and she was asleep within minutes, which told her how tired she'd actually been. They rode back to Red Hollow. The next morning, and Aldrich filed 3 documents in 2 hours at the county clerk's office, while Evelyn stood at the counter and watched the clerk's face for any sign that he was going to create difficulty. He didn't. He was a small, precise man who appeared to be entirely loyal to whatever the paperwork said was correct, which meant he accepted every filing without comment and stamped each one with equal indifference. Small mercy. She'd take it. She went to the general store to tell Ruth what was happening. Ruth had become something between an informant and an ally, and she'd decided a long time ago that people who were genuinely useful deserved to know the shape of the situation they were useful in. And Ruth listened and then said carefully, He's going to be at the public meeting tonight. Evelyn stopped. What public meeting? Crow called a town meeting, posted it yesterday while you were gone. Ruth said it with a flatness that meant she'd been thinking about it. Tonight at 7, the meeting hall. He's listed it as a community welfare discussion. Evelyn understood immediately what it was. It was a public forum where Crow intended to introduce the moral welfare inquiry to the general public, to make it a community conversation, not just a legal one, to recruit the town's judgment, to make sure that by the time Harlan arrived, everyone in Red Hollow had already formed an opinion. She went to find Caleb. I was at the livery talking to Sheriff Beale. She came up behind them and waited until Beale saw her and tipped his hat. Miss Harper, he said. His tone was neutral. She was beginning to respect its neutrality. Sheriff, she looked at Caleb. He called a meeting tonight. She watched Caleb's jaw set. Beale said, "I know, I got the notice." He paused. "It's a legal meeting. I can't stop it." "I know you can't," she said. "I'm not asking you to." She looked at him directly. "I'm asking whether you intend to be there." A pause. "Public meeting," Beale said. "Sheriff ought to be there." "Yes," she said. "He ought." She left them and went back to the ranch, and she stood in the kitchen for a while with her hands on the counter and thought about what Aldrich had said. Keep it in reserve. Do it after the hearing if you need to. She understood his reasoning, and she respected it, but she also understood that Victor Crow had just changed the schedule, and that responding to the schedule he'd chosen meant accepting that he controlled the terms. She was not going to accept that. She heard Lily in the other room. Margaret had brought her back that morning, given what was happening. And the sound of her, that particular running commentary she kept up with the world around her, settled something in Evelyn's chest. She went to the back room and picked Lily up and sat on the edge of the cot. "I need to tell you something," she said, which was absurd because Lily was 9 months old and her opinion on legal strategy was limited. But she'd always talked to her this way, since the night Martha died, and she wasn't going to stop. "I'm going to that meeting tonight," she said, "and I'm going to say the thing I've been saving." She looked at Lily's face, which was currently focused on attempting to reach Evelyn's ear. "Because your mother spent a year being ashamed of things that weren't her fault, and nobody stood up for her, and I'm not going to let the same thing happen to us." Lily grabbed her ear and pulled. "Ow," Evelyn said. "Yes, I know. That's enough of that." She put Lily down and went to find Caleb. But the meeting hall held about 60 people, and it was full by 10 minutes to 7. She sat near the back with Caleb on one side and Margaret on the other. Aldrich had wanted to come, and she'd asked him not to. A lawyer's presence made it look legal, and she didn't want it to look legal. She wanted it to look like what it was, which was neighbors talking to each other about their lives. Crow stood at the front of the room in his good coat and looked comfortable, because he was used to rooms that did what he wanted. He spoke for about 15 minutes. She listened carefully to all of it. The concern in his voice, the carefully chosen words, the way he described the situation at the Wilder Ranch in terms of community welfare and the protection of vulnerable parties. He never said her name. He never said Lily's name. He used phrases like uncertain arrangements and undocumented circumstances and the welfare of a child in an unsettled situation, and each phrase landed the way he'd designed it to. Not as accusation, but as worried question. He was good. She'd known he was good. Watching him work was clarifying, because it stripped away any remaining uncertainty she had about whether he deserved what was coming to him. When he finished, there was a murmur in the room. Some of the faces she recognized, some she didn't. Ruth was near the middle, arms crossed, expression opaque. Sheriff Beale was to the right, leaning against the wall. Crow opened it to questions. She stood up. She felt the room notice her immediately. That shift in attention that happens when someone unexpected moves. Crow's eyes found her, and she watched something cross his face, very briefly, before he arranged it back into pleasant readiness. "Miss Harper," he said pleasantly, "I'm glad you could join us." "Mr. Crow," she said, and then she turned slightly, so she was talking less to him and more to the room. "I'd like to say a few things, if people will hear them." She didn't wait for permission. She told them about her sister first. Not the version she managed, not the cleaned-up one. She told them who Martha was, funny, stubborn, terrible at choosing men, a person who made hard choices in hard circumstances, and who loved her daughter with everything she had. She told them what Martha had done to survive, because Crow's lawyer had apparently found it and was going to use it, and she was not going to let someone else name her sister's story before she did. The room was very quiet. She told them about the train platform, the $3, the baby on her hip, and the man with flat eyes who told her the man she'd come to marry was gone. She told it factually, without asking for sympathy, because facts were their own argument. She told them about the ranch, about the fence cuts and the barn fire, and the well that had gone bad on Margaret's property, and the note that had come due faster than expected on the Henley claim. She named each one. She cited the dates. She looked at the room while she said it and did not look at Crow. "He's been doing this for 2 years, she said, not to strangers, to your neighbors. People you buy things from and share roads with and sit next to at meetings like this one." She paused. "He's doing it because there's water under Caleb Wilder's land. And if he controls that water, he controls what every ranch and farm in this territory can do. Whether your animals live or your crops grow is something he gets to decide. She let that sit for a moment. Tonight he called this meeting to talk about the welfare of a child. I'd like to tell you about the welfare of a community. She talked for another 10 minutes. She'd thought it would be harder to stand in front of 60 people and say what she was saying, but it wasn't hard. It was the opposite of hard. It felt like putting down something she'd been carrying the wrong way and finally carrying it right. When she finished, the room was still for a moment. Then Margaret Halverson stood up and said, "Every word she said about my well is true. I'll put my name to it." Purcell stood. "Mine too. About the barn." Clembreyer stood. His brother stood beside him. The Reyes family, in the third row, stood together. One by one, the ranchers she'd sat with at kitchen tables and helped write their statements stood up in the meeting hall and made themselves visible. Not every person in the room, not even most of them, but enough. Enough that the balance of the room shifted, and you could feel it shift like a change in the air before weather. Crow stood at the front and his face had gone to something careful and closed. He looked like a man recalculating in real time, which was the first time she'd seen him look like anything other than certain. Sheriff Beale pushed off the wall and said, "To the room in general, I think there's enough here that deserves looking into, properly." He said it like a man who'd made a decision that day and was implementing it now. It wasn't an arrest, it wasn't a verdict, it wasn't even a promise, but it was a sheriff saying this matters in a room where 60 people heard it, and that was not nothing. Crow left before the meeting formally ended. She watched him go through the door and thought, he's not done. He won't be done until he's out of options. She knew that. But he was rattled. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train into this territory, Victor Crow was rattled, and she'd done it with the truth about her own life, which was the one thing he hadn't been able to plan for because he'd assumed she'd protect it. She'd decided she didn't need to protect it. The truth of what she was and where she'd come from was not the weakness he'd thought it was. It never had been. She just needed to stop carrying it like it was. Outside the meeting hall, the desert night was clear and cold and full of stars, the way it got at elevation when the heat finally released its hold. Caleb was beside her, close enough that their arms were almost touching. "That was," he started. "Don't," she said. Not sharply. She just didn't want praise for it. She'd done it because it needed doing, not because it was brave. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was going to say exactly right." She looked up. He was looking at her with that expression she'd stopped being able to pretend she didn't recognize for what it was. "Oh," she said. "All right then." He held out his arm, and she took it, and they walked back to the wagon where Margaret was waiting with Lily asleep against her shoulder, and the stars were relentless overhead, and the hearing was 6 days away, and nothing was over yet, and she was not afraid. The 6 days before the hearing were the strangest kind of waiting, the kind where there was still too much to do to feel afraid, but fear was there underneath everything anyway, like water underground. She kept moving. That was what she knew how to do. She went through the ledger one final time, checking every entry against the statements Aldrich had collected, making sure dates matched and no detail contradicted another detail. She found 2 small inconsistencies, one in Purcell's statement, where he'd written October when he meant September, and one in her own entries where she'd recorded the barn fire as starting before midnight when Caleb had said it was closer to midnight exactly. She corrected both and noted the corrections and the reasons for them, because an unexplained correction looked like a cover-up, and an explained one looked like care. Caleb rode out to check the repaired barn wall twice in those 6 days, not because it needed checking, but because he was the kind of man who managed anxiety through useful motion. She understood that. She didn't comment on it. Lily, indifferent to all of it, was attempting to walk. Not successfully. Not even close. But with the absolute conviction of a person who had decided this was happening and whose body had not yet received the message. She would pull herself up on a chair leg, release it, stand for one precarious second with her arms out like a small bewildered bird, and then sit down hard on the floor. Then do it again. And again. Evelyn watched her do this on the evening before the hearing, sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet, and thought, "That's it. That's exactly it. You just keep standing up." She didn't say it out loud because it would have sounded like something stitched on a sampler, and she had a strict policy against sounding like something stitched on a sampler. But she thought it, and it helped. Judge Harlan arrived in Red Hollow on a Wednesday morning in a plain wagon with a clerk and one travel case, which was the kind of arrival that told you something about a person. Men who needed to impress people arrived with more. He was 60 or so, thin, with the kind of face that had been weathered into something particular over a long career of looking at people who were lying and people who weren't, and needing to tell the difference. He set up in the largest room of the county building, which was not large, and he sent word that he'd hear arguments beginning at 10. Evelyn was there at 9:45 with Aldrich and Caleb and the ledger wrapped in oilcloth. The coalition ranchers sat in the rows behind them. Margaret, the Bryars, the Reyes family, Purcell, all of them in their good clothes, which in some cases meant a cleaner version of their work clothes, and she loved them for it. She loved the plain, stubborn fact of their presence. Crow arrived with his lawyer and two other men she didn't recognize. He looked composed. She'd expected that. The composure of a man who'd been in these rooms before and knew how they worked. She looked at him and thought, "You sent a woman to tell me I didn't belong here. You sent a man with flat eyes to the train station to make sure I understood I had nowhere to go. You tried to use my sister's death as a weapon." She thought all of it clearly and without heat, because heat was not what she needed right now. She needed the same thing she'd needed since the train platform: clarity. Harlan came in, and everyone stood, and it began. Aldrich was precise and thorough and gave nothing that wasn't needed. He presented the case in sequence: the timeline of Crow's acquisition efforts, the pattern of incidents across multiple properties, the documentation in the ledger, the statements from 8 ranchers, Ruth's account of Deke's movements on the night of the barn fire, and the survey filing challenge. He spoke for 40 minutes without being interrupted, because Harlan was the kind of judge who let people finish before he decided what he thought. Then Crow's lawyer stood up. He was good too. She'd given Crow credit for hiring well. The lawyer's name was Forsyth, and he was calm and precise and structured, and he made the case that every incident cited could be explained by factors other than deliberate harassment. Fence cuts happened. Barn fires happened. Wells went bad. The patterns Aldrich described were, in his framing, the anxious interpretation of a group of ranchers who'd been unwilling to accept fair market offers for their property. He spent considerable time on the water rights filing. He had documentation, the survey, the procedural filings, everything done correctly on paper. He argued that Crow's interest in the territory's water resources was a legitimate business interest conducted through legal channels. Then he turned to Evelyn's situation. He did it carefully. He didn't attack. He expressed concern. He used the phrase unsettled circumstances twice, and the welfare of the child 3 times, and he never once raised his voice or said anything that could be quoted as cruel. She sat still through all of it. Caleb, beside her, was very still too. When Forsyth finished, Harlan looked at the room for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Harper." She stood. "Mr. Aldrich has submitted your documentation. I've read it." He looked at her directly. The way she'd come to believe indicated he was actually paying attention rather than performing it. "Is there anything you want to add that isn't in the written record?" She thought about it for a real moment, not a performed one. "Just one thing," she said. "Everything in that ledger is true, and we can account for every word of it. But I want the court to understand something about why it exists." She paused. "I started that record because my father lost a land dispute when I was 12 years old, because he had his word and the other man had a ledger. I decided that day I would never be the person without documentation." She looked at Harlan steadily. "Victor Crow has been betting, this whole time, that the people he was pressuring were too scared or too uneducated or too beaten down to document what he was doing. He was almost right. We were scared, but we wrote it down anyway. That's all I want the court to know." She sat down. Harlan made a note. She couldn't see what it said. The hearing lasted until mid-afternoon. Harlan called a recess at noon, during which no one ate much, and reconvened at 2, and heard additional testimony from Margaret and from Purcell, both of whom spoke plainly and well. He asked Crow's lawyer 3 pointed questions about the survey filing timeline, specifically about whether the survey had been conducted with the knowledge of the property owner, and Forsyth's answers were technically accurate and visibly uncomfortable. Harlan noticed the discomfort. She could tell because he wrote something else down. At 4 o'clock, he said he would issue his findings the following morning and dismiss the room. That night was the longest night. She didn't sleep much. She lay in the dark and listened to Lily breathing in the cot across the room and ran the hearing through her mind the way you did when you couldn't stop yourself. The moments that had gone well, the ones she wasn't sure about. The expression on Harlan's face when Forsyth answered the survey question. She was not confident. She was fairly certain Aldrich had done everything correctly, fairly certain the documentation was solid, fairly certain the pattern they'd assembled was visible to anyone looking at it straight. But courts were not certain things, and judges were human, and Crow had resources she didn't have access to. She thought about what she'd do if it went wrong. She thought about it practically, not desperately. If the complaint was dismissed, what then? If the water rights claim was allowed to stand, what then? She was not good at surrender, but she was good at adaptation, and she made herself think through the alternatives because planning for the worst was not the same as expecting it. At some point, she fell asleep with these thoughts still running, and when she woke before dawn, Lily was sitting up in the cot looking at her with the particular alert expression she had in the mornings, ready for the day, cheerful in the absolute and unreasonable way of someone who had no concept of what the day might hold. "Good morning," Evelyn said. Lily said something with great conviction that was not yet a word. "I know," Evelyn said. "Me too." Harlan's findings were read at 9 in the morning in the same room, with most of the same people present. He was thorough and methodical, and she made herself listen to every word rather than jumping ahead, because jumping ahead was how you missed the thing that mattered. On the harassment complaint, he found sufficient evidence of a coordinated pattern of interference with multiple property owners to warrant a formal investigation by the territorial sheriff's office. Not the local sheriff, the territorial one, which meant it went above Beale and above anyone Crow had influence with locally. He cited the barn fire specifically, and the well contamination, and the note manipulation on the Henley claim. He ordered that all of Crow's acquisition activities in the territory be frozen pending the investigation. On the water rights filing, he found the survey procedurally invalid on the grounds that it had been conducted without the knowledge or consent of the landowner, and he voided it. He noted that Crow was free to pursue a legitimate water rights claim through proper channels, with notice to the landowner and opportunity to respond, but that the existing filing could not stand. On the moral welfare panel, Aldrich's challenge on composition grounds had already technically succeeded before the hearing, but Harlan addressed it directly anyway, finding that the panel as constituted had not met the neutrality requirements of the territorial code, and therefore its convening was invalid. He looked up from the paper when he finished reading. The room was very quiet. "I want to be plain about something," Harlan said. He wasn't reading now. He was talking to the room. "The law gives people tools to protect what's theirs. It also gives people with resources the ability to use those tools in ways that are technically legal and practically harmful. What I've seen in this record is the second kind." He paused. "The people who brought this complaint did it right. They documented, they organized, they came here with evidence instead of grievance. That's what the law asks for, and I don't see it as often as I'd like." He looked at Evelyn briefly, not long, just enough to land. "The investigation will proceed, that's all." He stood. Everyone stood. He left. She sat back down because her legs suggested it would be a good idea. Caleb put his hand over hers on the table. He didn't say anything. She didn't need him to. Crow left Red Hollow before the week was out. Not quietly, exactly. A man like that couldn't leave quietly. But with a speed that suggested he understood the territory had changed, and he was not going to be able to change it back. The territorial investigation moved faster than anyone expected, partly because Aldrich had prepared the file so thoroughly that the investigators had everything they needed without having to build it themselves. By the following spring, 2 of Crow's acquisition deals had been unwound through court order. The Henley claim, the couple who'd lost their land when the note came due, got their property back through a territorial ruling that found the note sale had involved fraudulent misrepresentation. It was, as Aldrich told her when he wrote with the news, the kind of outcome that happened about once every 10 years when everything aligned correctly. Deke left the territory. She never heard what became of him. The Moral Welfare Panel inquiry was officially closed with no findings, which was the legal equivalent of it never having happened, though she knew from experience that things that never officially happened sometimes left marks anyway. She watched for those marks in the way people looked at her over the following months, and she found fewer of them than she'd expected. The meeting hall, it turned out, had mattered. Standing up in front of 60 people and telling the truth about Martha had not fixed how everyone thought about her, but it had fixed how enough of them did. Ruth at the general store stopped watching the door when Evelyn walked in, which was its own kind of welcome. Sheriff Beale, 2 months after the hearing, came to the ranch and sat on the porch and had coffee and told her that he'd been doing this job for 16 years and that he regretted not moving sooner. He said it plainly, in the way of a man who'd been thinking about it and wanted to say it directly. She said, "You moved when it mattered." "Barely," he said. "Barely counts," she said. He nodded and finished his coffee and left, and she thought about that for a while, about how many people in life moved barely, at the last moment, not from cowardice exactly, but from caution that had hardened into habit, and how barely was still different from not at all, and how you had to make room for that difference if you wanted to live in a world with other people in it. The garden came back fully that summer. She hadn't planned it to be as large as it became. She'd started with one corner, then another, and somewhere around June, she looked up from her work and realized she'd taken over most of the south side of the house, and the tomatoes were doing things that could only be described as ambitious, and there were beans climbing the fence she'd never intended to be a trellis. Caleb observed all of this with the expression of a man who had opinions and had decided not to have them. "If you want me to pull back the beans," she said. "The beans are fine," he said. "The fence is fine," he said. "Evelyn." She looked at him. "It's fine," he said, more quietly. "All of it." She looked at the garden, the overgrown, ambitious, sprawling thing it had become, and thought about the dead stalks she'd found when she arrived, the cracked earth, the corners she'd replanted in those first cautious weeks, when she wasn't yet sure she had the right to change things. She had changed everything, and he was telling her it was fine, and he meant it, and she knew he meant it. "All right," she said. She went back to the beans. Lily took her first real steps in September. Not the 1-second stand and fall she'd been doing since spring. Actual steps, 3 of them, from the kitchen chair to Evelyn's outstretched hands, with the focused, wobbling intensity of a person who had been planning this for some time and was executing on schedule. She made it, grabbed Evelyn's hands, looked up with an expression of pure, incredulous satisfaction, like she'd just confirmed a theory she'd always suspected was correct. Then she sat down hard and immediately tried to stand up again. Caleb was in the doorway. He'd come in from outside at the exact wrong moment, or the exact right one, she wasn't sure which, and he'd seen all 3 steps. He stood there with the particular stillness he had when something caught him off guard in a way he hadn't armored against. Evelyn looked at him over Lily's head. He looked back. 3 steps, she said. "I counted," he said. His voice was slightly different than usual, slightly less managed. She looked down at Lily, who was up again, wobbling, arms out, conducting an argument with gravity. She thought about the train platform and the $3 and the suitcase and the baby on her hip, and she thought about everything that had happened in the months between that moment and this one, and she thought, "I did not know, standing there, that this was where I was going. I only knew I was not going to stop." That was the thing she wanted to say, if she were the kind of person who said things out loud to people who couldn't hear them yet. To Martha, to her 12-year-old self, to the woman who'd stood in the desert heat with nothing but a decision not to break. "You didn't know where you were going, but you kept going anyway. And look," she didn't say it, but she felt it, which was enough. Lily took 4 steps this time before sitting down. Progress. There were things that didn't get fixed, because some things didn't. She still woke occasionally in the night with her chest tight, a residue of the months when everything had been precarious. She didn't always know, in those moments, whether what she was feeling was memory or caution, and she'd decided that it didn't entirely matter, that you could live alongside the echo of hard things without letting the echo run the day. Caleb had his own version of it. Years of building a life around expecting people to leave had left a habit of watchfulness that didn't disappear just because the circumstances changed. She noticed it in small ways. The way he sometimes said things that were careful where easy would have been fine. The way he looked at her occasionally, as if confirming she was still there. She understood that. She'd spent enough of her own life checking that the things she had were real. What she'd learned, what she was still learning, was that the checking didn't go away entirely. You just got better at recognizing it for what it was. Not the truth of the situation, but the shadow of an older one. And you let it pass without treating it as prophecy. They were both people who'd been worn down to their foundations by life and had built back from there. That gave them a particular kind of honesty with each other that she thought was worth more than the easier version, the kind that didn't know yet what it was capable of surviving. Aldrich came through the territory the following spring on other business and stopped for 2 nights at the ranch. He sat on the porch with Caleb on the first evening, and she could hear them talking. Not what they said, just the low sound of it. And she sat inside with Lily on her lap and felt the particular quality of that moment, the ordinary domesticity of it. The dishes from supper drying on the rack, the lamp burning low on the table, the sound of 2 men talking on the porch while the desert cooled around them. She had not known she wanted this. That was the honest truth. She'd come here looking for security, which was a reasonable and modest thing to want, and she'd arrived at something considerably less manageable and considerably more. She reached for a word that didn't sound like something off a sampler. Real. It was real. That was all. It was imperfect and daily and full of things that didn't resolve neatly and people who didn't behave perfectly, including herself, and it was the most real thing she'd ever had. Aldrich came inside to say goodnight and looked at the 2 of them, Evelyn at the table, Lily asleep against her shoulder, and said, "You look like a woman who's home." She considered arguing with the sentiment on the grounds that it was obvious, and then decided not to. "I am," she said. She thought sometimes about what she would say to a woman standing on a train platform with nothing. Not advice. She hated advice that was really just a story about the person giving it, but something true. She'd say, "The thing you're afraid of, the ground dropping out from under you, it already happened. You're still standing." She'd say, "The people who are supposed to save you will sometimes not show up. That's not the end. That's just information." She'd say, "Document everything. Not because it always works, but because facts are the only thing that can't be taken from you once you have them written down." She'd say, "Find the people who are afraid alongside you. Fear that's shared gets lighter, not gone, lighter." And she'd say, "Maybe if the woman on the platform looked like she needed it, the place you belong isn't always the place you plan to go. Sometimes the plan falls apart precisely because it was pointing you somewhere you were supposed to end up instead." She didn't believe the world was designed. She'd seen too much of it to believe that. But she believed that people were more durable than they looked, and more capable than they knew. And that the moments that seemed like endings were sometimes the beginning of something that couldn't have started any other way. The train platform, the $3, the baby on her hip, all of it had been necessary. All of it had been hers. She was not the woman who had been abandoned on that platform in the desert heat, waiting for a man who didn't come. She was the woman who had stopped waiting, picked up her suitcase, and walked into town. And she was here. And Lily was walking now, 4 steps, 5, 6, falling and getting up, conducting the same argument with gravity that she'd been conducting since September, and seemed to believe she was gradually winning. She was probably right. They usually were, the ones who didn't stop getting up. Evelyn watched her cross the kitchen floor. 6 steps, 7, 8, and didn't say anything, just watched, because some moments didn't need words. They just needed someone to be present for them, to see them and hold them and carry them forward into the days that came after. That was what she'd do. She'd carry it forward.